Alrighty, my friends, welcome back for another quick video talking about environmental policy. The 1970s were a great decade for environmental law. And if you have interest in law or policies, just in general, policy making, creating, amending, whatever, I highly encourage you to look further into some really, really good policies that were created and mandated starting in about the 1970s. It's kind of when we're like, oh, hey, we can actually make some adjustments here. So that's kind of exciting. We are going to start talking about arguably the most important environmental law, because it really kind of jumped right out for folks. This was signed into law on January 1st, 1970 by President Nixon. And I think it is interesting to note that Nixon sits on the right side of the aisle, or sat on the right side of the aisle. And I feel like at least in modern right-leaning folks don't care as much for the environment, or at least don't try to make policies that are regulatory of the environment. But what is really special with this particular policy is that it requires federal agencies to assess the environmental effects of their proposed actions prior to making decisions. So this means like permit allocations or federal land management actions, construction of highways and publicly owned facilities, things like that. So really, really fascinating, I think. Even like, perhaps you've heard of the festival Burning Man, and how it's held at a particular location every year. They actually have to go through a very stringent permit process that is checked over by the Bureau of Land Management, the BLM, before they are allowed to come back each year. And oddly enough, the Burning Man org passes with flying colors pretty much every year, which is kind of wild, considering that you have somewhere or something, an environment so pristine that you go from no city to a city of roughly 70 to 80,000 people for a week or longer, and then no city again. And so they make it's leave no trace is a big part of that culture. Anyway, so that's just something that pops into my head when I think about and like permit allocations and things like that. But also like construction of highways and publicly owned facilities. I think that part's really interesting as well. Thinking about even if you put a highway through a forest, are you going to be cutting off environmentally, you're going to be cutting off species from each other in terms of that depend on one another or provide services for one another, that kind of thing. So why is NEPA so important? So NEPA applies anytime federal land, money, or permits are involved. So anything federally. NEPA requires environmental assessments and or environmental impact statements. So if the project falls under NEPA, the environmental assessment must be performed. So if the assessment shows significant environmental impacts, then an environmental impact statement, or EIS, must also be prepared. And that EIS must talk about the nature of that project and why it's needed, why it's necessary, the environmental impacts of the proposal, including long-term and short-term effects, and then perhaps alternatives to the action that will lessen the adverse effects. What's fascinating here as well is NEPA requires public comment be solicited when preparing an EIS. So basically it's like, okay, well, let's get the public's opinion on this. And then this also allowed for the establishment of the Council on Environmental Quality. I do also want to mention that that within this idea, this is kind of based more federally, but there can be more state and local laws that are very similar to this. So this was like a stepping stone almost. This was almost like you can kind of think of it as like a cookie cutter piece of legislation because it allowed for other states to follow after this and maybe even be more strict or less strict. I know California kind of gets talked about a lot because of how many regulations we have. But I mean, at least our buildings are relatively safe, right? We have decent infrastructure. It's kind of a different sort of idea, but similar sort of vein here. So really, overall, Nepa revolutionized environmental policy, right? So it really kind of stepped us into the right direction of now allowing for the government to have more, to have more say on what could be happenings. So again, there's tons of environmental policies out there, all of which are really, really fascinating. Your book goes through a few of them, but this is one that really sparked it off. So again, if you're into policy and policy writing or even urban planning, things like that, these are all things that you would have to take into account. So if this is your specialty, then that is exciting. If not, then hey, still a fun and interesting thing to learn about. So thank you so much for watching.